Today I will drill, baby, drill. As of today, male and female. We are going to be the Gulf of America. In everything we do, we will not forget our God.
This week marks the beginning of our reckoning with America's truths, with the realization that Trumpism is the very product of our own societal tendencies. Donald Trump was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States, a man whose term was marked by controversies that tested the very fabric of our democracy and whose push back to power defines both political norms and moral imagination. Trump's second inauguration comes not in the shadow of past controversies, but in the glaring light of ongoing investigations and an alarming disregard for accountability. Many of us are looking at a broken, oppressive system and wondering, what happened? How did we manage to get here again? In reality, the system just did what it does, exposing just how deep its patriarchal roots go. Misogyny, racism, hate, capitalism, the upholding of white supremacy. Some push back and say, America is better than this, or this isn't who we are, forgetting that America was built on the genocide and exploitation of Indigenous and Black people. The America we fail to see is a broken country where bodies are controlled, people are dehumanized, and power grabbing is prioritized. To truly understand what this inauguration means, we must zoom out. It is not just about one man or one administration. It is about a system that allowed such a return, a system where political ambition and unchecked corporate power supersede ethical governance, where oligarchs are able to buy votes and decision-making power. Misinformation has fractured our shared reality, and where accountability for the most powerful remains elusive, if not impossible. The reemergence of Donald Trump as president serves as a mirror. It reflects the growing cracks in the foundation of our democracy, cracks widened by systemic inequalities and a deepening polarization that has turned truth into a battleground. It compels us to ask hard questions, but perhaps most importantly ask, what does this moment demand of us now? We cannot afford to treat this inauguration as just another transfer of power. It is a moment to interrogate the state of our democracy and the forces that shape it. It's a moment to examine the complicity of our institutions, the failures of our leadership, and the role each of us plays in what comes next. Unchecked power is unpredictable. History teaches us that moments of great fracture often precede transformation. This podcast exists because we believe in the power of conversation, in the possibility of change, and the resilience of those who refuse to accept injustice as the status quo. Let's reflect on the events of Donald Trump's first term in office. It's almost difficult to distill his presidency into a single narrative, given its sheer volume of controversy and upheaval. From the Muslim travel ban to the impeachment proceedings over his dealings with Ukraine, from the family separation policy at the southern border to the handling or mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The first term was a relentless series of shocks to our societal and political system. We saw the rise of alternative facts, an emboldened far-right movement, and a growing erosion of trust in institutions ranging from the media to the courts. Yet Trump's presidency also solidified a loyal base of supporters, galvanized by his toxic, misogynistic style and his promise to drain the swamp. Nationalism at its core creates dangerous divisions that can easily be stroked through false narratives. It builds on fear, giving hate the fuel it needs to thrive. Trump's Muslim ban executive order during his first term blocked the entry of individuals from several Islamic countries, especially Syrian refugees seeking protection in the United States. The Trump administration cited terrorism as the reason for the Muslim ban, giving validity to white Americans' inability to think that a terrorist can be anyone other than a brown-skinned, Arabic-speaking Muslim or anyone that looks Muslim. Shortly after being sworn in for his second term on Monday, Trump signed an executive order titled Protecting the United States from Foreign Terrorists and Other National Security and Public Safety Threats, with language that is both vague and arbitrary, stating, "It is the policy of the United States to protect its citizens from aliens who intend to commit terrorist attacks, threaten our national security, espouse hateful ideology, or otherwise exploit the immigration laws for malevolent purposes." Creating polarizing narratives, fear-mongering, and villainizing the other have been tools used again and again by autocratic leaders globally, including Donald Trump. Narratives such as J.D. Vance and Trump's infamous baseless claims of immigrants eating cats and dogs stroke fear and reinforce erroneous and divisive stereotypes about immigrant communities. While baseless, these narratives reflect a broader strategy of weaponizing cultural anxieties to galvanize support among Trump's base. Monday's inauguration was filled with moments of just sheer absurdity. From Trump making it a priority to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, to Elon Musk doing what appeared to be a Nazi salute while thanking Trump supporters. With tech billionaires in seats of honor more central than cabinet members, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island warned that Trump effectively handed billionaires the power of the federal government to loot the hardworking Americans who pay their taxes and keep this country running. The growing role of billionaires in spaces that are meant to uphold the interest of the people should not be taken lightly. In his farewell address last week, President Biden warned of a new American oligarchy, the tech industrial complex. Crony capitalism, also referred to as cronyism, is a political economic system where businesses and the government work together to their own advantage, where elites leverage their proximity to power to secure favorable regulations, lucrative contracts, and market dominance, while political administrations gain financial access and resources and institutional support to maintain their influence. It's characterized by unfair advantages given to businesses and individuals with political ties. Crony capitalism in the United States reflects a long-standing tradition of intertwined political and economic power that has shaped societies for centuries. Just take a look at the Rockefellers in America's Gilded Age. Powerful families and business elites have historically aligned their interests with those in political power, often blurring the lines between private wealth and public governance. These alliances have sometimes driven economic growth, but they have more commonly concentrated wealth and influence within an elite circle, perpetuating systems of inequality. But Trump's return to power is not an anomaly in global history. I reflect on how democracies around the world are being shaped by autocratic leaders, thriving on the consolidation of power, the oppression of dissent, and nationalism. Across the world, we've seen contentious leaders rise and fall, only to rise again on the waves of populism. Consider the return of Silvio Berlusconi in Italy after scandals that might have derailed any other political career, or the resurgence of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is under investigation for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Or look at leaders like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and Viktor Orbán in Hungary, whose strongman tactics and appeals to nationalism garnered fierce loyalty from their supporters. What binds these leaders together is their ability to frame themselves as champions of the people, saving them from demise and external threats, weaponizing disinformation and division to maintain their grip on power. Globally, we see a rise in the nationalist rhetoric and authoritarian tendencies, often masquerading as solutions to economic instability and social discontent, sometimes self-manufactured to offer the appearance of being the savior of a problem otherwise created out of thin air. In countries like India, Turkey, and Russia, leaders have consolidated power by stroking fears of external threats and suppressing internal dissent, using polarization as a tool to maintain control. Meanwhile, traditional alliances and international institutions have been weakened as leaders increasingly prioritize short-term domestic gains over collective global action. As we examine Trump's second presidency, it's critical to analyze the very real implications for governance, policy, and global affairs. On day one, Trump marked the start of his second term with a series of executive orders and pardons, two presidential privileges that fuel Trump's sadistic passion for authoritarian rule. In addition to revoking 78 of Biden's executive orders, including ones that protect LGBTQ plus people, immigrants, the planet, and women's health, and issuing many more executive actions, he pardoned nearly all of the 1,600 individuals charged in the January 6th insurrection, effectively ending all cases. It was clear that this time around, Trump was prepared to execute on the full powers of the presidency. To begin unpacking Trump's terrifying transformation of the government, we must understand the role of executive orders. Executive orders are the most recognized form of presidential directive, a category that also includes proclamations and other executive actions. These orders, which carry the force of law, enable presidents to instruct federal agencies on specific actions. While only Congress can create laws or allocate funds from the Treasury, the president wields significant authority in enforcing and implementing laws. Many executive orders address routine matters, but others have profound and enduring societal impacts, such as Franklin Roosevelt's order for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. On Monday, Trump's executive orders ranged across distinct categories: immigration, climate, trade, DEI, and public health. From reversing a Biden order that eliminated DOJ contracts with private prisons and expanding the use of the death penalty, Trump also signed EOs renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America and Denali, the name given by Alaskan natives, to Mount McKinley. I'd like to take some time going over some of the key executive orders, since the news about the sheer volume of orders can be overwhelming at first. Keep in mind, this episode was recorded the morning of Tuesday, January 21st, so there are likely to be updates between then and the time you are listening to this episode. Let's start with immigration, a cornerstone of the Trump campaign rhetoric. We are seeing a resurgence of hardline policies that could mean pushing to complete the U.S.-Mexico border wall and reviving the Remain in Mexico program. Day one was marked with executive actions that included suspending refugee resettlement, ending asylum protections, halting nearly all immigration on the U.S.-Mexico border, and ending birthright citizenship, though the latter will face significant constitutional hurdles since the Constitution explicitly guarantees citizenship to those born in the United States. Trump also declared a national emergency at the border to justify deploying troops and unlock funds to build the border wall. Additionally, federal officials have shut down a government app CBP-1, that allowed nearly 1 million migrants to schedule appointments at ports of entry, effectively eliminating a critical resource for processing and legal entry. Trump has also promised aggressive deportation efforts, aiming to launch what he calls the largest domestic deportation operation in U.S. history. On climate change, Trump's record speaks for itself. From withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement to rolling back environmental protections, his actions have consistently prioritized economic gain over ecological sustainability. Under this administration, we will likely see a resurgence of deregulation that undermines efforts to combat climate change and protect vulnerable systems. Trump rolled back much of Biden's environmental policies. He's likely to repeal new fuel efficiency standards, expand oil and gas drilling on federal lands and waters, and lift the moratorium on liquefied natural gas export licenses. Trump is expected to deliver on his "drill, baby, drill" promise and issued an executive order declaring a national energy emergency on Monday to authorize expanding drilling in Alaska, allowing more domestic oil and gas production. The U.S. will be, once again, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, an international climate pact. You might remember he pulled out of the treaty during his first term, only for Biden to rejoin on day one of his presidency. This decision removes the world's largest historic emitter from global efforts to combat climate change for the second time in a decade. It positions the United States alongside Iran, Libya, and Yemen as the only nations outside of the 2015 Paris Agreement, a pact in which governments committed to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels to prevent the worst consequences of the climate crisis. This, of course, aligns with his broader agenda to eliminate regulations on U.S. oil and gas drillers, enabling them to maximize production. The escalating threats on trans rights from conservative groups in the United States have become a focal point in the broader culture wars, with trans individuals increasingly targeted through legislative and social campaigns. These efforts include bills restricting access to gender-affirming healthcare, banning trans participation in sports, and criminalizing the discussion of gender diversity in schools. Conservatives often frame these measures as protecting children or upholding traditional values, but the consequences are dire, ostracizing trans individuals and legitimizing discrimination. This backlash has emboldened a broader wave of anti-trans rhetoric, casting trans identities as a threat to societal norms rather than a reflection of human diversity. Day one of Trump's second term began with an executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government, which made it the policy of the United States to recognize only two sexes, male and female. These hardline policies aim to roll back the Biden administration's efforts to support and recognize transgender individuals at the federal level and dismantle federal programs promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. For example, one of the Biden executive orders rescinded by Trump included an order that directed the federal government to prioritize racial equality in policymaking. Additionally, a government official stated that Trump would direct the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and other federal agencies to ensure that official government documents, such as passports and visas, reflect, quote, accurate sex designations in alignment with the policy. Trump is expected to reverse Biden's executive orders on family planning and abortion funding abroad, reinstating the Mexico City policy, also known as the Global Gag Rule, and rejoining the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which opposes an international right to abortion. Nonetheless, day one was marked with the withdrawal of the United States from the World Health Organization. This new administration can strip away reproductive rights and healthcare access in many ways, using its power to set domestic and international policy, appoint federal judges and officials, push through ideologically motivated rules, issue executive orders, and much more. Project 2025 listed numerous strategies to limit abortion access and other reproductive services. A majority of Project 2025 contributors worked in the first Trump administration or in his campaign or transition teams, and many are expected to serve in a second Trump administration. Threats to reproductive rights include ending access to abortion medication, allowing hospitals to deny life-saving abortion care, establishing an abortion surveillance system, forcing states to report personal data on those seeking abortions, embolden the prosecution of abortion providers and patients, and ultimately institute a national abortion ban. On trade and the economy, Trump is expected to continue relying on tariffs as his primary policy tool, stating a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada starting February 1st. Trump called for an assessment of previous trade deals, particularly those with China, Mexico, and Canada. He also moved to create a new agency, the External Revenue Service, to collect tariffs. While Trump has said he'd prefer to use sanctions sparingly, his first term saw record-breaking use of them. Many analysts predict he'd return to a maximum pressure strategy. The specifics remain uncertain, but his history suggests sanctions will remain a critical tool in his foreign policy playbook. Civil liberties stand at a precarious juncture. Trump's past rhetoric and policies have often marginalized vulnerable communities, from limiting access to women's health care to endorsing discriminatory practices under the guise of religious freedom. Media freedom, already under siege globally, could face even greater challenges as his administration continues to vilify journalists and tighten control over public narratives. It is not a coincidence that companies such as Meta will no longer be fact-checking content. The rollback of protections for transgender individuals, attacks on reproductive rights, and a troubling tolerance for police overreach all point to a broader erosion of civil liberties. Now, let's take a moment to look at the saga that unfolded this past weekend. During his first term, Trump himself spearheaded efforts to ban TikTok, citing concerns over its Chinese ownership and potential national security risks. Fast forward to now, after the app went dark this past weekend, Trump announced on his social media platform that he would issue an executive order delaying the ban to negotiate a deal, and sure enough, he did. Essentially playing savior to an issue he himself initiated in his first term. Just hours after Trump's message, TikTok was back online with a message thanking Trump for his support. Behind the scenes, tech companies have been working hard to align with Trump's vision. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and other tech leaders have been cozying up with the president, reshaping their platforms and policies in his favor. It is clear that tech companies such as Amazon, Google, Meta have a lot on the line, including regulatory challenges that could shake the very core of their businesses. Although federal regulators began cracking down on Google and Facebook during Trump's first term as president, experts expect his second administration to ease up on antitrust enforcement. A second Trump term will undoubtedly influence global affairs, emboldening other leaders with similar authoritarian and fascist tendencies and weakening the international community's ability to respond to global crises. This presidency is not just a domestic concern, it's a global one. Turning to the global stage, the second Trump presidency has reshaped relationships with both allies and adversaries. Among allies, we see tensions with NATO countries who have grown weary of the United States' unpredictable stance on defense commitments and trade agreements. Historically strong partnerships have been strained by an America First agenda that often sidelines multilateralism. Then there are adversaries, or perhaps opportunists. Nations like Russia and China have leveraged the U.S.'s internal divisions to bolster their own global influence, often creating fake content intended to stoke strong, polarizing emotions. And let's not forget the ripple effects on countries that look to the U.S. as a cultural and political model. From Egypt to Hungary, we've seen leaders echo Trump's rhetoric to justify authoritarian policies and suppress dissent. The role of media and storytelling in this divide can't be overstated. Trumpisms, those snappy, provocative, and often divisive statements, are intentional because they are amplified by media outlets that often operate as echo chambers. At the same time, resistance movements have harnessed storytelling to build counter-narratives, although these are only variably picked up by the media. But here's the challenge. How do we create spaces where dialogue can happen in an era of information silos? This moment demands not only reflection, but action. It's easy to feel disempowered, jaded, and even apathetic and withdrawn in the face of continuous threats and infringement of human rights. But history has shown us that grassroots organizing can be the bedrock of change. From local communities to national coalitions, people are mobilizing to push back against authoritarianism and safeguard democracy. Stop Project 2025 Task Force, founded by Jared Huffman and Ayanna Pressley, are actively working to counteract right-wing extremist policies targeting reproductive rights, climate justice, and civil liberties. Groups like Indivisible provide resources to build local political power, resourcing individuals to influence policy decisions directly in their communities. Meanwhile, the Sunrise Movement continues to rally young people to fight for climate justice, and organizations like the ACLU and Black Lives Matter lead the charge in protecting civil rights and chipping away at systemic inequalities. Now is the time to get involved, whether by joining these movements, supporting their efforts financially, or even starting your own local coalition. Change begins with each of us, and together we have the power to shape the future. In the show notes for this episode, we've included resources to support safety and rights across various fronts, from undocumented protections to reproductive care. If you know of organizations providing aid to communities impacted by the Trump administration, please share them with us in the comments or via email. We'll continue to update these resources to support the fight for human rights. In the words of Cecile Richards, the former president of Planned Parenthood, who passed away just hours before the presidential swearing-in, for people who face challenges based on race, geography, income, and more, these inequities are deep-seated, intersectional, and much more difficult to eradicate. We need to be ready for a multi-year fight. Art of Citizenry remains deeply committed to unpacking the systemic inequalities that perpetuate harm. With an emphasis on intersectional justice, this podcast is dedicated to challenging listeners to unlearn and consider more restorative, community-centered approaches. Through conversations, we hope to shed light on the complexities of these issues while inspiring action and accountability. It is our responsibility to ourselves and one another to do everything in our power to build, nurture, and sustain networks of community care. We must take this moment as our calling to build together, nurturing relationships rooted in compassion and reciprocity. We must cultivate resistance movements collectively to effectively challenge the systems that continue to uphold our oppression. Let us collectively plant new roots, sprout new ideas, and nurture a community that allows for restorative and regenerative relationships to thrive. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Noah Kowalski.